Okay. All right. So on behalf of the Embody Your Culture team, I humbly welcome everyone who has joined us today. And we hope that you leave our event today with a greater understanding of the complex ways in which our cultures influence our body image perceptions. I will quickly introduce our fantastic team who will be moderating and hosting the event tonight. We've got Alison, Gayatri, Hannah, Charlotte, Supipi, and myself. Supipi and I will be your hosts for the night. Now, without much further ado, I would also like to introduce the chief guests, our panelists for the night. Ms. Jamie Chan, who is a clinical psychologist and a social psychologist, and a second-year PhD student at the University of Sussex. That's right, she's dialing all the way from England. Jamie's research focuses on body image with a particular focus on objectification and self-objectification through a cultural lens, particularly through ethnicity, social class, and its intersectionality. Next, Ms. Vani Kakar, who is a clinical psychologist and a final year PhD student at the Center for Emotional Health in the Department of Psychology at Macquarie University. Vani's doctoral project surveyed over 900 participants living in Australia, India, and Iran to understand body image perceptions and appearance satisfaction. Her primary research focus is on understanding the nexus of culture, beauty, and body image in an increasingly globalized world. Vani's also currently in India. Last but not least, we have our homegrown superstar, Dr. Kristen Murray, who holds a doctorate in clinical psychology. She is a current researcher and lecturer at the Australian National University. Dr. Murray's research and practice focus on understanding the body image more holistically about what our bodies look like and their functionalities. Now, with all that done, I hope you all come out of this event and say, wow, just attended an international panel on body image and culture. All right, so we shall dive right into it. And if any of you in the audience have any questions as the discussion progresses, please type it in the chat and the moderators will select and pose it to the panelists. Please be assured that everything typed into the chat will only be seen by the hosts and not other audience members. We've done this as we understand body image and culture can both be very sensitive topics, and we want to create a space where you can freely engage without the fear of judgment or discrimination. Now, Fifi, take it away.
So before we start off with more specific questions, we thought it was important that we started off with a more general question. So this question is to all of the panelists. How do you define body image, and what's your perspective on the relationship between body image and culture? Vani, did you want to start off?
I don't have much of an option now that you've said, but hi everyone. It's lovely to be here and very happy that we're talking about some very, very important things, especially within the intersection of culture and body image. So to start with, body image, I think in the most simplest terms it consists of various aspects. And I know that a lot of people have, defined it from a research perspective, but the simplest way I try to understand is how you feel, think, and perceive your own body. So it could be anything related to your own body, anything that relates to appearance, and just, the simplest way. But yeah, I'd like to hear what Jamie and Kristen have to say too.
I think that's literally like the most standard answer of what body image is. So now I'm like literally cracking my brain to come up with a different definition. But I think Vani has pretty much defined body image, but I'm just gonna talk about how I tend to see body image. I think body image is like a really special concept because it's kind of like a bridge between the external and the internal. So body image might be an internal concept that's in your head, but it's also affected by the environment that you're in. So it's it's like this concept that constantly interacts with your environment and also like your internal states. That's kind of how I see body image. As for the cultural bit of that question, I think, you know, like culture lives in all of us, and there is no one size fits all in terms of body image. And it works very closely with one's culture. I think that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you, Jamie. And if Kristen could also give us her opinion on what she thinks.
I think I've got the hard job going third, trying to add to both,
Yes.
both of those. Yeah, I think, you know, I think the way we feel about our bodies or the way we relate to our bodies is essentially what body image is. It's everything about the way we think and feel and behave. And I loved both the contributions from Vani and Jamie around, you know, the many different ways, aspects of our environment or our experiences or the identities we hold, including culture and beyond culture, of course, as well, impact upon the way we feel about our body and how we engage in the world as a result of that. And the only thing I think I can add is that it's complex. Anyone who dives into body image realizes really quickly all of the different constructs and all of the different ways we might relate to ourselves, both in positive but also potentially negative ways. So I agree wholeheartedly, it's really important and it impacts our life in really meaningful ways that can be great and can be not so great as well.
Thank you. We'll dive right into it. We'll start with Vani. This is a question for you. You are doing a multi-country survey on the cultural ideals of body. What were the most interesting findings from this so far?
Thanks, Leslie. Yes, it's so just to tell everyone a bit about my research is I'm kind of exploring beauty ideals and body image in maturing girls across Australia, China, India, and Iran. So what I did was kind of ran a study. It's a multi-step procedure, but it was essentially serving these girls in their local language, which is kind of important to note, because I think anything when you're approaching beauty or body image literature, I think one of the instant limitations is like we understand anything about beauty from English language journals. And I think it kind of screams out stuff that's published in their local language. And but we also say that we don't know much about, well, non-Western cultures or different social identity groups and etc. So I think this is all, so what I'm trying to do is kind of better our knowledge and examine and contribute to the literature in that way. So I think one of the most interesting findings, and there are a few, so bear with me, is that I think the main one would be, while I did find that ideals fluctuate across these 4 different cultures, the effect sizes of these relationships were small. So what that basically means is that there are differences, but they may not, you know, you could, because sometimes when you have large samples, it can be based on chance and, you know, you can get significant results. So we tend to not get very excited about that. But the take-home message from my research is mostly that ideals are pretty similar in the sense that regardless of whether you're sitting in China or Iran or Australia or India, you hold very similar views of what is physically attractive for a girl, right? Because that was my question. It was like, what do you think is attractive? What do you consider beautiful for a girl? So I kind of included a range of different body, facial, and hair attributes. And I think mostly what we know about cross-cultural beauty ideals is based off weight, shape, and size research. So I wanted to build upon, but you know, there are other salient aspects of appearance, you know, because we know that there's so much more cultural variation when it comes to skin tone. So I found that in my research, there were, so for example, like I said, I was studying 4 cultures. Australia and India were somehow more similar, but China and Iran were similar in some way because I felt like they maintain their traditional ideals a little bit for certain aspects like skin tone. And I know Jamie will have much more to contribute on this, but in terms of skin tone, I found that girls in India showed an equal preference for tan skin tone and a fair skin tone, a fair ideal, which is really interesting because if you know the background of the country and rooted in colonialism, you know that, and this was true for most societies across the world, was like lighter skin was associated as like, more beautiful and desirable, and it was admired cross-culturally. But in Western cultures, over time, it also signifies wealth and more resources, etc. So I think it could be a reflection of just mirroring the Caucasian ideal a little bit. So one of the interesting things that I found was that in the 18 different attributes I assessed them on, the most popular was not the thin ideal. And I think more than skin tone, that is I was sort of relieved to see that because, these are maturing girls. And if you look at the adolescent research, you know that they're one of the most vulnerable subpopulations prone to experiencing appearance-related dissatisfaction. So even though we've heard about, globalization of the thin ideal and thin ideal being the most prevalent. And while that was popular, it was not the most popular. So we saw that the girls wanted something like a curvaceous ideal with, a slightly toned physique, but with average body weight. It was not, which is interesting because if you look at the curvy ideal and look at the literature, it doesn't necessarily focus on thinness so much. It's interesting to see that. But I think one of the things to also keep in mind is that these things may mean different, you may interpret and negotiate these ideals differently across different cultures. That's why I think I really resonate with what Jamie said about, the environment you live in is really important because how you interpret, for example, tanned or fair in different cultures can mean different things. How somebody sitting in China interprets a certain aspect of, appearance versus somebody sitting in Iran. So it's also sort of subjective, but also kind of embedding local, aspects of a culture within global influences, and not limited to Westernization. I should point that out because I think Western media is usually very quickly accused of things, but there are other influences as well. So mostly that.
Right. So you mentioned that within Australia and India, there wasn't actually much of a difference in beauty ideals. Do you know why this might be, considering that the cultural context is so different?
Yeah, so I think why it was also not very different from China and Iran would be a second question, would also be because China and Iran have strict press laws in terms of what they can access within their local context. So for example, there are strict press laws for exposure to Western media, but in India, you don't have that so much. And these are like rapidly growing economies. And so there's no limitation or restriction in terms of what you access. And that may vary for girls in China and Iran. Also, because I think Iran is more traditional in the way that they have a cultural restriction of wearing a hijab, which is a mandatory head cover in their culture. So you would see females with a head cover where only part of their face and hair are visible with hands. So I think that that's why I said local context is important. But I think more similarity between India and Australia does not surprise me. Because I would imagine that part of it would be increasing globalization.
Can I just add that I think there's also a common denominator between India and Australia, the Brits.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, Vani, just another quick question. Why did you choose to focus on female participants instead of the general population in your project? Like, how do you think the pressures of body image or acculturation or like just the cultural pressures disproportionately, do you think that they disproportionately affect different genders?
There's mixed support for that, and it was not, I'm pretty much interested to look at different genders and different, the whole population. I started with adolescent girls. It was at the time what my center was focusing more on as well. So I proposed, well, I want to study young adults, and it kind of got altered, but that doesn't mean that there's research to suggest that, you know, females experience higher pressures to look beautiful, and you know, dissatisfaction rates are high, but then there's also research that says no, well, that's not true. So it's just, I think over time I'm pretty sure that I will be studying more than just adolescent girls. It's just kind of the first step for me, because I'm kind of also interested to see how different people across different cultures negotiate beauty in general, because a lot of physical attraction literature also looks at male perspectives and role of acculturation. How well are you integrated into some other country, or whether you're kind of holding on to your own culture, and how do you manifest that? So I'm really interested in kind of digging deep into this cultural aspect, but Australian PhDs also last only 3 years, so my time is limited. Yeah.
This is a more general question to all the panelists. For BIPOC CALD identifying individuals living outside of their cultural context, what can be the impact of being in a culture with different ideals on their body image? Like Vani just said, how Australia and India reported similar beauty ideals, whereas China and Iran had similar. But whereas, what would happen then if we had Iranian migrants living in Australia? Like, how does that impact on the body image perceptions? And is there greater levels of body image dissatisfaction?
In so many ways, but I will try and be succinct about this. I think when a BIPOC individual lives in a different context than their original ethnic culture, there is bound to be conflicting ideals, because there is one cultural ideal that is from the ethnic culture, and there's another ideal from the mainstream culture. And depending on how different these ideals are, it creates different extents of conflicts. And then again, it depends on various factors in how this conflict feeds back into their body image, their body esteem, stuff like that. But on a different note, in terms of like acculturation, there is something to be said about discrimination as well. So we ran a study a couple of years ago on ethnic teasing, so appearance-related ethnic teasing among South Asian women living in the UK. And we found that those who experience appearance-related ethnic teasing experience more body dissatisfaction because they experience more skin color dissatisfaction. And we think that it's because, you know, skin color is a pretty prevalent ideal amongst South Asian women. So it goes to show that acculturation is a big thing, because appearance kind of displays your group belonging from a, you know, like from a social psychology perspective. The way that you evaluate a person's belonging, whether it's to the majority group or to, you know, your ethnic culture, it's immediately evaluated based on your appearance, because it's an external cue. It's like the first thing that someone sees of you. So in that sense, I think it does create some body image issues amongst BIPOC individuals living in like Western societies, especially.
That's really interesting. And I also understand that, Jamie, that you're currently doing research on self-objectification through a cultural lens. So I just wanted to ask for everyone in the audience, I'm pretty sure this is a new term. So what is self-objectification, and how is it, what's the relationship with body image and culture?
So honestly, self-objectification, okay, maybe I should define this first. So traditionally, objectification or sexual objectification refers to when a woman's body or body parts is singled out from their person. So if they're evaluated based on their body or body parts from an external perspective, and typically this is the male gaze, that's considered sexual objectification. Obviously, in the last decade or so, more and more literature has come out on like objectification of men as well, but it certainly started from like women. So self-objectification is basically when you look at yourself from an external perspective. So you're looking at yourself from an observer's perspective. And again, that's typically the male gaze. So that's what self-objectification is. There's a bunch of studies out there that shows that, you know, self-objectification leads to poor body image. So women feel more shame, they feel more anxiety about their bodies, they have more appearance-related thoughts. So they think about their bodies a bit more when they do self-objectify. And honestly, I don't think self-objectification has been explored from a cultural lens enough. There are some studies suggesting some things, but like it's not conclusive. How it relates to culture, essentially, the way I look at it is basically how culture shapes that relationship between, you know, people, the extent to which people self-objectify and how that affects their body image. Particularly in my PhD, I'm sort of looking at culture from like a fairly like wholesome lens. So like social class as a culture as well, and like ethnicity as a culture. So it's not like culture does not necessarily mean ethnicity in my PhD, basically. So I'm kind of looking at it from that lens, and also like the intersectionality between the two.
So I know you just said that you don't think there's enough studies that look at it from a cultural point of view, but just based on your understanding or your past research, do you think that the fetishization of ethnic bodies play into this?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, to begin with, like the evaluation of a person based on their appearance in itself is objectification, right? So fetishization is therefore objectification. And I think, I mean, obviously this affects people differently, people of different cultures differently, but I also think that this affects particularly like Black women a little bit more, just because of the historical oppression that comes with the culture. And there are a lot of stereotypes around as well that revolves around this image of oppression, for example, like hypersexualization of like Black women. That's an example. And it definitely feeds back into your body image, because the more you're exposed to these stereotypes or ideals, the more you tend to think about your body and police your body, either to feed back into the stereotype or to go in the opposite direction of the stereotype. And that in itself is self-objectification. And then again, it feeds back into the negative body image loop.
So then, are there ways that individuals can protect themselves against the harmful impacts of self-objectification? Or is there not enough research just yet?
I think, well, there are. There is a new body of research that is sort of like the opposite of objectification. Well, I call it the opposite, but there's a new body of research in embodiment, which is kind of like the experience of like living in your body and kind of like experiencing the world through your body, through your lived experiences. And there has been some research that suggests that certain activities promote embodiment. So stuff like yoga, I've seen, is something that promotes embodiment. Belly dancing is something that promotes embodiment. Those are the two that I can remember off the top of my head. But yeah, embodiment.
Thank you. I think this leads nicely into our next question, and this is directed at Kristen. your research focus is predominantly on the body functionality and its protective mechanisms against body image dissatisfaction. And you aim in your practice to look at cognitive behavioral therapies, right? So when dealing with negative body image and what our body does for us rather than what it looks like is what body functionality is. Can you tell us a bit more about this approach and what are its benefits and drawbacks to building a positive body image?
Yeah, sure. That is a lovely lead in. Thank you, Jamie. Body functionality, I guess, as has been flagged, is kind of part of seeing our body as bigger than its appearance. So most of the work in the body image field really is focused on the aesthetic aspects of the body, and that partly draws from objectification theory and also the eating disorder context in which body image research developed. And it's kind of long been recognised that the experience of the body is not just about what it looks like; it also includes what the body does. But there's been a real sort of limited focus in research on that, and increasingly over recent years, we've started to focus much more on how we relate to body functionality, what that actually looks like or what that means, and some of the benefits that might have for us, particularly around countering that objectification process, because the kind of clear focus is on focusing internally or on what our bodies are doing rather than using that sort of observer's or gaze or surveillance of the external aspects of the body. So in terms of what body functionality actually is, it's kind of anything your body can do. It can include, of course, things that you can't do. So body functionality can be a source of distress as well as a source of sort of appreciation or gratitude. So that is important to flag for people that might have functional concerns or difficulties that can actually lead to dissatisfaction with body functionality specifically. But more often than not, we're looking at body functionality as something that can be protective when we focus on all of the things that our bodies might do in our lives. So that could be physical ability or physical movement. That's most often what people focus on, but it can also include health or internal processes like healing or digestion, the kinds of ways we communicate and maintain relationships. So being able to speak or hug somebody, or, show them physical support, and also things like our cognitive processes, the way we can think, the way we look after our body day to day by eating or sleeping, those kinds of self-care behaviors as well. So body functionality really is kind of very broad, and some of the research that's really interesting is when we do focus on our own body and focus on things that our bodies do in our life that are personally meaningful for us, it has positive benefits for body image. Most of the studies that have been done are in women in particular, and women that are looking to improve their body image. But the studies show that there are increases in body satisfaction, in body appreciation, functional appreciation, and reductions in self-objectification as well. So it has benefits for our body image, and of course we know that body image is associated with other mental health outcomes and things like disordered eating, and so it then could be preventive for those outcomes, or at least reduce those if somebody is presenting with those as well. The other positive benefit is that some research now has demonstrated with these interventions focusing on body functionality that are mostly writing interventions, that people with chronic conditions, so specifically a study with women with rheumatoid arthritis that have sort of concerns around body functionality as well as appearance, that the same benefits were seen in that population as well, and they were sustained at 1 month. So we are seeing it's not just a benefit in the moment, but it can also have a longer term benefit, at least at that kind of period of time. So generally it's looking pretty positive, I would say, in terms of body functionality, but there are a couple of, I guess, caveats. One is that the research is new, so there's a lot we don't yet know, and there may be some aspects of function that are more powerful than others, or maybe not. Most studies have been in women. There are some effects that have been shown in men as well, but mostly they're in sort of female identifying populations, and so that's something, I guess, for us to be looking into further about who else or who may not benefit from that approach, the longer term benefits beyond 1 month. And there is some evidence that I think is important to flag, that that if we focus on other people's body functionality, so there's some work in the exposure to ideals space around seeing images in the media, for example, that when we look at bodies that are idealized bodies in active poses, so they're sort of functionally salient, that can have negative impacts. So we do see some of the same relationships between functional dissatisfaction and mental health, or associations with things like depression, and there's potential that some of those negative processes that play out around appearance could also occur in the functional domain. So there are some really positive aspects if we're looking at appreciation and valuing our functionality, and there's potential that, of course, function could be a source of distress, or some other negative processes could play out. So it's an area that's really only in the last 10 years. So there's there's research coming out in this space, which is really exciting, and I think has great potential to enhance interventions as well.
So I'm not sure if much research has been done on this, but I think body functionality kind of differs between cultures. For example, menstruation, it's seen as something that is a good function in some cultures, and then in others you're told to hide behind doors, don't talk about it. So I guess, how would you address these differences in cultures regarding body functionality?
I think that's a great question. I don't think I know the answer to that. I think it's such a new area, and we need to be looking at how culture might make aspects of function salient, or the way we relate to function more or less salient. There's a tiny bit, I was having a look at a chapter today, there's a tiny bit of qualitative research that suggests that functionality might be something at least that's sort of salient across cultures, but that was, of course, just, you know, in some studies. So I think it's an area we need to be looking into. And I mean, I love the comment on menstruation. That's not something I've seen in the functional space very much, and something I would love to be doing research into. But maybe Vani and Jamie have comments on that. I'd be really interested. I haven't seen stuff around that, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, we had just a few other questions in regards to the functionality space, but I guess I think that I just need some clarification. Is body functionality posed to be a protective mechanism to counteract body image dissatisfaction, or is it a similar concept to body image? Body functionality is just a parallel concept which can both negatively and positively influence body image.
So I think it's a bit of a mix. So body functionality itself, as a term, is just referring to functions of the body. That's all it is. When it becomes part of body image, it's when we're looking at sort of thoughts, feelings, or behaviours oriented to body functionality, in the same way we might look at that with respect to appearance. So we can talk about, you know, dissatisfaction or evaluations of the body as a dimension of body image, and that could be focused on or oriented towards aesthetic components like weight or shape, or functional components like physical ability or communication or sensory processes. So it's kind of, you can think about it as almost like an aspect of the body, and then our appraisal of that or how we relate to that is where it turns into an aspect of body image. So sort of functional body image is a term that's kind of used to describe that, that application of function in that space. The focus on whether it's protective or not probably depends on whether we're looking at it in terms of sort of more of a negative body image or a positive body image lens. But if we're looking at just orienting to functionality, which is that almost that counter to self-objectification as a process, that's what's considered generally protective. If we're focusing on, but then also appreciating the functions of the body. So that's using a sort of positive body image lens in the way we're relating to the body. But equally, from a negative perspective, you could invest too much self-worth in your body's functionality, or you could express dissatisfaction. So body image, I guess we flagged earlier, is complex. There's many sort of layers, but functionality could just be what you're referring to when you're looking at body image. But in and of itself, it's just looking at functions of the body or the things our bodies do in our life.
Thank you, Kristen. We've just had some audience questions come in. There's been a little bit of a delay. So we have often framed cross-cultural contexts as having a negative effect or conflicting role on body image. In what ways can culture positively inform body image? And this is, I guess, Vani, your research touches on this, and Jamie as well.
Yeah, I think just like body image, I think role of culture is in no way straightforward. And I think that depends on where exactly are you studying culture? Are you looking at people who are in their local culture, and also how you define culture, right? Because there's so many ways you could define cultures, and still it could be, again, negotiated and interpreted in different ways. You could be a Chinese person in China, but may not associate with the culture in that sort of way. So I guess like one of the things that I was trying to do with my research is screen people. So I also looked at just to get a sense of their ethnic identity and the strength of that identification with their culture. I asked them which culture do you associate yourself with? And then there was this broad definition of culture, which could, like Jamie said, it doesn't only translate into one thing. And it's not just about ethnicity, it could be different. So I saw like a lot of girls, and I think this goes back to like one of the reasons I saw the value in studying maturing girls was because of the pubertal transformations and how that intersects with where you're at, what you're exposed to, and how do you accommodate that in terms of just how you generally feel about your body. So not just about what you consider attractive, but what does that mean for you and your body perception. So, because there are all of these like simultaneous changes, and, there was something about, protective factors against body dissatisfaction. So I'd just like to say that there's some research to suggest that in some cases, culture is a protective factor, but then which cultures would protect you from experiencing dissatisfaction. So for example, there's also evidence, and this is probably like just specific to, because I'm studying Iran, there's some evidence saying that wearing the hijab protects you against body dissatisfaction. And interestingly, what I found was that despite feeling that they're very discrepant, so discrepancy between how they are versus what they want to be, they were the most satisfied with, as compared to girls from Australia who were least satisfied with their appearance. So in some ways, it's just, I think the role of culture is really complex because it's people. So when we ask them, what culture do you associate yourself with? Or are there more than one cultures you affiliate with? And then which culture do you affiliate with more? There were participants across all four cultures who said things like the Western culture or the global world or a certain kind of dance form or a certain kind of ethnic culture or, so just, I guess, the main point is that culture is like really complex, and it could mean different things than somebody's nationality, ethnicity. It basically induces a sense of association with something, and it could be like, I was happy to see like somebody said some sort of dance form that they associate with, and that's their culture. So this is not about, it was no longer limited to gender. It was no longer limited, because there were responses of all sorts. And that's interesting to see that when you ask people what they identify with, there is just a lot of diversity. And that's partly why I felt that responses on just what they think is attractive was really diverse, homogeneous, but yet diverse, is because they kind of, does that make sense though? Not sure if that answers the question, but. Yeah.
It does. And I've just got a quick question about finding that you just brought up with in terms of Irani teenagers finding that they have a greater sense of body image satisfaction when they're wearing the hijab. Do you think that this is because of the religious affiliation, or do you think that this is more to do with the physical covering? Because I know for like a fact that if I go out because of the masks, like I'm like a bit more freer, you know, now we have to wear masks, and so I don't wear makeup when I go out. You know, you're less under the scrutiny of others' judgment, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think is the cause? Do you think it's a religious reason? Do you think it's because there's a greater sense of religious connection? Or do you think it's more just a physical barrier?
I think that it's, again, not a straightforward answer there, but one of the things that I was trying to do was just dissect this a little bit because, you know, there's some research to say that some cultures value certain aspects more than the others. For example, you know, how there's just a general comment about, oh, Asians focus more on facial appearance. In my research, I didn't find that to be true. I think that, and this was true for most cultures, was yes, they felt discrepant. Yes, there was a discrepancy between self and ideal. That's why the first step was to understand what their ideal was. And I also looked at attainability, which is a different conversation. But in terms of importance of features, I didn't find that, for example, girls in Iran found facial features to be, or rated that to be more important than their bodily features. So beauty for girls in Iran has largely been negotiated with what is visible, but that doesn't mean that they don't interpret body as being a malleable thing. So if you know, you look at trends, you would see that Iran has one of the highest rates of rhinoplasty, especially in adolescent girls. So nose surgeries are extremely popular because that's the part of the face that is visible. For example, you know, there are banks in Iran who will give you loans to get a nose job. And that is true. And that's a very culture specific thing. You will not find such a thing in India. So that's why the local thing becomes really important. But what's interesting is, like, generally, despite being culturally or linguistically or economically diverse, there is still, they're holding similar views. But again, they may be dissatisfied or satisfied, but it's all based on what they think is important. So they might be they might feel discrepant, but still feel satisfied because, well, some features are just not important to them, as we have assumed, or the body image research has largely assumed for certain cultures.
So my next question is to all of you. So as psychologists, did you find that in your training that you were underprepared to deal with cultural issues, or that there was a lack of emphasis on not just cultural competency, but also about clinical manifestations that differ between different cultural groups?
I can tell. Jamie, would you like to?
No, go on, Kristen.
That's a really important question, and it's a hard one. I think more and more this is it's changing. There is training. Was it enough? Probably not. And there's never enough training in anything. I think when you do your training, there's so much to learn. So I think one of the things I think there is a lot of emphasis in training is that each person is different to the next. So everything about that person, you need to be when you're working in any kind of clinical context, you need to understand that person, with all of the parts of that person, and that person's the expert on themselves and their experiences. And so my I think there's always more we can do to provide training and to learn as researchers, as people, as clinicians in whatever roles we're filling, to understand specific areas. And I think, the big emphasis when I was doing my training, that continues now as much as I'm aware, is really around making sure every single person that you meet, you're understanding them to the best of your ability and having conversations with them about what their life looks like and what that means, and how you can develop a shared understanding of what's happening for them together. That's probably how I would answer it. Of course, it would be great to have heaps more training beyond, competence and looking at specific areas. Of course, I think that's really important, and there can always be more. And I think that's probably the area that I think is probably important to highlight as well, around the general approach to every person that you meet when you're in a clinical setting. But maybe Vani or Jamie want to add to that.
So I haven't really been in clinical settings very much, but I'm just gonna spin this and answer this from a research perspective. I just don't think that there are enough tools out there that has been validated using a diverse sample. Even the measures that we're using in research, they are mostly validated by white samples. And if we're using scales that hasn't been tested in a diverse sample, and then using body dissatisfaction, for example, that we use all the time, it hasn't necessarily been tested in a really diverse sample, but we use it as a gold standard to measure ethnically diverse women's body image. But what that is actually telling us is that we're measuring that dissatisfaction based on a white perspective. It doesn't necessarily reflect that cultural aspect of women's body image. I think I remember coming across this study that found, so they were looking at the internalization of ideals and body image, and they found no relationships between women of different ethnicity. But then when they broke down that internalization to Eurocentric features, Afrocentric features, they found differences. And it just goes to show that the measures that we have are not nuanced enough to capture these cultural differences.
Totally agree.
Thank you.
I
sorry, go, Vani, go on.
No, just I totally agree with Jamie, and I think one of the issues with body image research in general, and one of the biggest criticisms, has been it was historically considered just an affliction on the West, and then it was oh, so it also impacts males, and that was a surprise. So I feel like body image researchers have such a huge responsibility to sample diverse populations, but the limitation for that is, like Jamie said, it's all based on, well, we don't have validated measures, and not just cross-culturally. It's just, I think the language really matters, how it translates, how different concepts translate. I had such a huge issue because I didn't find a measure that was looking at things other than thinness or shape or size, and I wasn't interested in that. And I just didn't want to do a measure of skin tone, but I wanted everything, because to arrive at a fuller picture, even in a clinical setting, you need something that is validated, that speaks to a certain culture, and then you need that sort of training. So I think it's both research and practice, is that we're so behind. I mean, obviously, I think that now there's a growing body of research that's kind of validating measures in different non-Western settings, but then there are people who are well, what is non-Western anyway? The role of West is not, so that's a different discussion, but I think that's one of the things that is the most important to address before we can have any more conversations about how can this help, how can we improve this, is because if we don't have validated tools, then that limits our scope to begin with.
So just how everyone mentioned that there's differences in validated tools and everything, and knowing that the impact that culture has on people's body image. It's different for every individual. Even if someone's from the same culture, it can still be different. So I guess the question is, how would we go about developing these validated tools? Because not only do you have to cater towards the local setting, you kind of also have to cater towards the individual, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously we can't, the thing with scales is that it serves to measure averages. So we obviously can't have that much nuance, like measuring individuals. But I think one way that we can try and diversify scales is to take into account like all aspects of the body. So the Western perspective is very focused on size and shape and weight. I think, like Vani said, like, you know, opening up to different features of the body or the face, it's step one to be a bit more diverse, I think. I don't know if Kristen and Vani has any other suggestions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think scale development is such a complex, difficult process as well. And yeah, I think that it's a really important point that when we're looking at large samples, we're always looking at an average. And I think that's where the looking at different research designs is really important as well. Qualitative studies tell us a lot of information that might then inform things like scale development. So we're more aware of what the differences or what the unique features are, or where the limitations are with the existing measures as well. So I do think there's a role for continued research understanding the impact or understanding unique ideals or identities and how they intersect. And I think that kind of work can then inform our measures. One of the really interesting things I think in the body image field is there are huge numbers of measures, and most of them are very similar, although they're obviously different because they're different measures. But they, exactly has been pointed out already, they were really developed within specific contexts. They're often validated only for young women. So even if we're looking across the lifespan, very few studies look at anyone beyond the age of 30. So there's a lot of areas for a huge field. There's a lot of space for improvement, and there's a lot of issues in terms of our measures. The only measure that I'm aware of from a positive body image standpoint that has at least been investigated across a range of different kind of at least national groups is the body appreciation scale. So there's some work in that, but there's a lot to be done. And I think that's a really important area. And one of the things I think is really interesting about body image is because it's so complex, to get a good measure of body image, you could ask 500 questions, but of course, you know, we can't ask 500 questions. So there's often, I've been doing some scale development recently, and there's often questions around, should we be really general with our wording so that people can answer in a way that means something to them, but is being so general, so difficult for someone to answer, you know, so that kind of specificity matters. And the general, you know, might be helpful or important, so we can get, you know, a body image measure where we talk about the body in general. So I think it's a very long-winded answer, but I totally agree. It's a really important area, and it's a hard one. We need some work in that space for sure.
Thank you, Kristen. Moving forward, we've just had some more questions come in. And this is about, has there been much research into the relationship between body image and culture in gender non-conforming individuals and in amongst the LGBTIQ plus society community?
I think body image research, recruiting gender non-conforming samples itself is rare enough, let alone investigating that from a cultural perspective. I've never seen any. I don't know about you guys.
Me neither. I've been interested to look at that, and I've been eager to find things. Obviously, I think there's some stuff that I've come across that generally looks at LGBTQ and body image and expression of beauty and And I think I've come across a few papers that have just generally looked at dressing or how that relates to one's individuality, but not, yes, I agree with Jamie. I haven't, unfortunately and sadly, but I hope that changes soon. Not sure about Kristen, if you've come across his.
No, I agree with both of your comments. Yeah.
That's quite a shame because non-gender conforming individuals and the LGBTIQ plus community in different countries, there's different sort of manifestations of body image, and there is different, it's a very complex, I know in India, it's a very, these societies that are very complex perspective. It's not necessarily completely stigmatized, it's sometimes glorified. And so, yeah, so I think this, yeah, I guess there really needs to be more research into this aspect. And now moving on, this is a question, I guess this is a lot to do with the objectification, self-objectification that Jamie talked about earlier. We find that parental acceptance and validation have been reported as huge influences on immigrant growth and experiences. And so when we have immigrant parents who tend to be, who feel entitled to the perfect children, to make all their sacrifices, you know, worthwhile, and to have their trophy child, we as immigrant children become more vulnerable to their criticisms about our bodies and appearances. To what extent are we able to dissociate from such mentality or ignore criticisms without compromising the unique cultural parent-child dynamics present? Is it a matter of having to choose one over the other?
That's a really tough question. I'm sure there's more to be said from like a developmental psychology perspective in terms of that parent-child relationship. But obviously that's not my area of expertise. I think the best thing, I don't think that it's a matter of choosing one or the other. I think there is definitely some ways to navigate this sort of conflict in parental expectations and a person's appearance goals, or like the mainstream ideal or whatever. I think in this kind of scenario, perhaps the best thing to do is to focus on the body, because that's, at the end of the day, that's the outcome that we're looking at, body image, right? And I think, you know, there are research that suggests that stuff like in boosting your self-esteem, that kind of helps improve your body image, regardless of parental pressures or like differences in ethnic cultures. And so I think that focus on the self and like self-esteem particularly might be a good way to kind of navigate the situation.
So then it's pretty apparent that friends and family, they have a huge impact on how we view our body, because, you know, we see how they view their own body, and that can impact how we view our own. So is there a way that we can kind of support our friends and family to build more positive body image, so that it's kind of like a whole community of just empowerment, I guess?
I can jump in with something. I'd be interested to hear from Jamie and Vani. I think from a positive body image perspective, one of the, I guess, core principles is around body acceptance of others. So I think one of the ways we can build our own positive body image and build positive body image in people around us is celebrate diversity, accept different bodies, and that everybody's bodies are unique and special and do great things. So I think that's a really consistent finding in the literature, that supportive relationships from others and acceptance of you as, you know, who you are, no matter what, in the body image field is good for body image. And so I think as human beings, that would be something I think we could all do to celebrate diversity and what makes all of us unique and special, no matter what we look like. So that would be my response from a positive body image perspective. But I'd love to hear from Jamie and Vani as well.
I think that's along the lines of what I'm thinking of as well. I mean, just to add on to that, I think we're at a time where positive body image is kind of blooming. Like, we're starting to see diverse bodies in the media and on social media and in adverts. But obviously, I would say we're at a starting point. Like, we haven't gone very far with this body positivity thing. So you would still see, you know, comments from people saying stuff like, oh yeah, like, you know, body positivity, it's big on Instagram. Like, I'm starting to appreciate my appearance. But then they would go on to talk about not having 2 takeaways in a week, you know, like stuff like that. So there's still a bit of a conflict in their mindset. But I think with enough exposure, if we keep going with, you know, presenting more diverse bodies in the media, hopefully we'll see some change at some point.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you. And one of the things that I was thinking and agree with is now we're at a place where there are obviously more platforms where people can question the mainstream ideals, right? So there's more like, this is not okay. And like, for example, like we used to have these fair and lovely fairness creams in India that have been damaging the country, people's self-esteem for decades together, because based on the culture you were from, or sometimes not, there's still the pressure to look right. And as you grow up, you receive messages of what that right is. And parents are also a source of that. How should you look? So they could be like, oh, you have a pimple on your face, or you are, well, looking a certain way, that, you know, any kind of comments. And I think in certain cultures, it's commonplace where other people would discuss your appearance while you were there. And I think that while there is diversity in the media, it also has messages of why the advantages of looking right. I think that's where we need that change as well. So it's, yes, I agree with Jamie, because that is the first step. But with looking right, for example, how being slim, tall, and fair has been idealized across cultures, you have also received messages of, if you look that way, what would that mean? And that has not changed very much. So you might have better prospects for marriage, or you might be paid well, you may be happier, you may be, you know, and the list goes on. And that aspect I don't see changing very much. Everybody, I think, gets fixated on, does this look diverse? But what it really means to be diverse is not so much people's focus. And that's the frustrating bit, because then you're stuck. And there's less of a scope to bring about that change that would kind of, you know, how some people argue that Asians' allure to beauty is more stronger than other cultures because they might experience more pressure. And one of the things that has been argued is that they biologically are far from the ideal, the mainstream Eurocentric American Caucasian ideal you see everywhere. And a lot of, like, so the answer is not easy, and diversity in media and other platforms is part of the answer, because, but not the complete one, because I think other messages that say that, okay, you know, diversity is good should also be more prevalent and promoted.
Thank you so much, Vani. I think this actually leads really well into my next question. What a main topic of our discussion that we wanted to focus on today in this event is the differences in the Western and non-Western. And so inherently within that is the differences of body image satisfaction or dissatisfaction in a collectivistic society versus an individualistic society. Jamie mentioned earlier in response to the parental acceptance question that we should focus on our self-esteem, but how easy is it to do that when we are brought up with communal upbringing where we give a greater number of our relatives or society the right to pick us apart, the right they feel obligated to do that, they feel entitled to do that. So I was hoping we could have some discussions in terms of this.
I don't think it's easy at all. I don't have very much to say in terms from like a research backed perspective, but I think from like a personal experience point of view, it's not easy. I think like to begin with, it's a lot of conscious effort because focusing on the self is in contrast to the collectivist culture that we're brought up in. And so I think the important thing is not to think about focusing on the self as a conflict to the culture, but rather just diverting some attention to focus on yourself. Like you're not explicitly rejecting that parental relationship, like going back to that question, but it's just that you're just thinking about yourself a little bit more and focusing on activities that would like raise your self-esteem and make you feel better about your body. I think, yeah, that's just from like a personal point of view.
Thank you. Vani, Kristen. Okay, we'll go on to our next question. Actually, we've had a question come up that wanted to bring okay, so with the body positivity movement being capitalized by mainstream media, they often portray a perfect or a version of diversity, i.e. curvy but slim thick, not fat, or rocky or melanin, but within particular shades, a particular shade range. Can this have negative effects on body image? This gets a bit more political, I guess.
Well, if no one is going, I will go. I do agree, like with the question to begin with. I do think that even though we are seeing more diverse bodies in the media these days, the diversity that we see are still stereotypical. They're like in the extreme ends of bodies. Like you don't really see people in like the gray areas, like the middle areas of the spectrum. And like certainly, like if your body is not represented in the media, it certainly presents issues. So like Vani said, there is a long way to go with, you know, body diversity. But I guess the very minimum of it is that we are starting somewhere, I guess.
Okay, that's really interesting. So to kind of bring it back to a more general question, we've had a question about the difference between body positivity and body neutrality. And in our surveys that we did through our social media, we actually found that people had differing views of whether they resonated more with body positivity versus body neutrality. And I just wanted to throw this question at all of the panelists. Is there one that is more protective factor against body image, or is it more sort of an individual choice?
I'm happy to throw out an answer. I don't know the answer, so this is just me providing some thought that ran through my mind. I think my understanding of the body neutrality focus is sort of having a neutral kind of relationship with the body. So I don't know, I haven't looked into it in terms of research, so I'm not sure what kind of literature base or how much literature base there is and how that might relate to body image. But I imagine if you're taking a neutral stance towards the physical self or the body, then it's that you're not deliberately trying to foster a positive relationship with the body. So I don't know if that's then associated with more positive body image or not. But I think given there's evidence that appreciative or accepting and respectful stance towards the body, which wouldn't be body neutrality, I'm guessing, is good. Or can be positive. So that's my immediate thought, but I haven't looked into it. So perhaps Vani or Jamie might know more about it than I do.
Yeah, I haven't looked into it either, but I think the immediate thought that struck me is that body neutrality, I think body neutrality might be, keyword being might be related to like the opposite of objectification, because objectification focuses on the physical appearance more than like the other aspects of yourselves. And I think if you're neutral about your body, then it just means that you're not giving physical appearance any more weight than other aspects of yourself. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Like I don't see it as a bad thing, but in comparison to body positivity, I don't really know what the relationship is.
Also, sorry for being quiet for the last 2 minutes. My connection was like everything was freezing out. But yeah, I think I agree with both. And I also haven't looked at this research-wise, but based on my general understanding, I think both of them covered what it is. And I would imagine that, and I don't know because I've not empirically seen, but both might be to certain degrees can protect against dissatisfaction, because if you're leaning towards feeling, well, you're not thinking or constantly thinking about this is the way I need to look. And, you know, like Jamie talks about focusing on different aspects of the appearance or objectifying, or even going, you know, feeling, doing things that would make you body positive, I imagine you would be more satisfied with your appearance as compared to somebody who may not engage in either body neutrality or body positivity. But again, this is not based off research. I don't know. This is pretty much like a hypothetical. I think that would be the case. I would be interesting to see. So that's a great question anyway.
Thank you. Vani,
can I add there? Sorry, Blessy.
Yes.
One thing I'm wondering with body neutrality that could be interesting is if it's particularly around something like an investment component of body image, because investments, if we invest too much in our body in determining our self-worth, that is considered maladaptive. But in the literature, there's a really sort of limited focus on what it might look like to kind of have a good investment in the body. So I think from a body neutrality perspective, actually on the investment space, it could be really helpful. It's kind of like my body is part of my life, but it's not the determinant of my worth and value as a human being. And at this stage in the literature, I don't think we have a very good sense of what it is to adaptively invest in the body. Like, would it be neutrality? Or would it be, you know, I love and look after my body and it matters in my life. It just doesn't determine my self-worth. So I think it's a really, I don't know a lot about it, but I think it's a really interesting concept. And I think both Jamie and Vani highlighted really important points around it as well.
Thank you, Kristen. Vani, do you think there are differences in how openly people talk about body image between culture? Or do some cultures have a taboo associated with body image, like with other mental health concerns? This is like, as we've done multi-country studies. Yeah, what have you found? Have your findings indicated anything towards this?
I think that as a starting point, I would go back to the cultures that I'm studying. And I think that traditionally, mental health in India is generally a taboo. I know it because I studied psychology here. Like from personal experience, even my own dad was like, one time I said, I think I should go for therapy. And as a part of like, you know, being a psychologist, you do supervision. And he's like, wait, what? And So I'm just trying to give you like, there's acceptance of, well, my daughter is a psychologist, but she shouldn't go to a psychologist, you know. And I'm speaking of a well-educated family. There is a lot of taboo around mental health, around seeking mental help in general, and that is slowly changing, especially with rise of social media promoting like steps to self-care, or like, you know, if you see generally, and one of the reasons I got into body image was that I was practicing at a hospital, and a lot of people came in talking about feeling very, well, not happy and dissatisfied with general things they saw on social media, and they couldn't talk about it like to people. And in general, I think that there is the culture is not, let's talk about it. That's, you know, when you think about traditional cultures or collectivist cultures, there is a certain like, everyone's trying to feed into a norm. So you want to be very similar to your other members of the group, like, you know, just kind of reflect more group membership. That's slowly changing. Even with body image, I think like you'd see young adults being more experimental with the way they look, but that would be different from how much they talk about it. So I don't, unless you know, you're in a setting where you're generally acknowledging, well, you know, things about the body can be different. I think that people struggle to talk about their own body image. They may express themselves differently, but I don't see that very much. And I think that in the qualitative aspect of my research looked at, are there any cultural restrictions in terms of the way you dress? This is a different aspect, but nonetheless, they did say, yes, you know, the pressure to look fair or using fairness creams. And you know, you can fight. Who will you fight when there's like implicit messages of you should purchase, like, you know, Kristen was saying, investment in your body is like, purchase this because the culture would then think that you would be beautiful, but it may be like very discrepant from what you really want to do. So it's kind of voicing these things that is not, I have not seen that much. And I imagine that this is very different for collectivistic / non-Western / you know, traditional cultures like India, especially Iran as well, where there's certain trends of like skin whitening or other stuff that's popular as compared to like more cultures that are open, who may also, and I might want to add this, openly talk about menstruation. So, you know, there are taboos around different aspects of one's, you know, just bodily experience that are not talked about. You know, how many people go and say, well, this is what hitting puberty might be like. And that's different for different cultures. And that's where it all starts, right? How much you talk about body image, how much you can talk about, I don't feel good. And that's where you're, you know, you might experience mental health issues. Not sure if that answers your questions, but it's like a mix of everything.
Yes. I just wanted to ask, like, when I wanted to see whether, do you think that this is a generational difference or a cultural difference? Because I know for a fact, like, if I have like, let's say I'll go to my friends and be like, oh my God, I look so ill today. This is terrible. And they're like, no, you look amazing. And like, you get that compliments return, right? But then if I go to my parents and say the same thing, they're like, yeah, that's right, go shower. You know, you don't get the same level of validation. So do you think that the openness, how open you are about your body image is based on who, like, the generational gap, or do you think it's because we are like, because I know Western cultures, like just personally, I would be more open to speaking about my body image concerns or satisfaction, either or, in a more Western society than I would in my own cultural society.
I would imagine that to be true. And I also want to see what Kristen and Jamie have to say about this. I think it might be both. It might be cultural and generational, because I don't think these things happen in isolation. As for anything, any mechanism, or really, that's why I think what I usually argue in my research is you have to have an intersectional approach. So you're not just looking at different cultures, but you're also looking at what really happens. Within those cultures, how do you relate to your family or your peers or yourself? And that would really, so it's just like, it's the multi-factor etiology sort of a thing that brings home and help and contextualizes everything.
There is this thing called relational body image as well, and it basically says that people's body image vary from individual to individual. So like traditionally we measure body image as like a trait or like as a state. So like if we experiment with whatever, then we measure state body image, like the state of their body image in that experiment or whatever. But there is this thing called relational body image as well that basically says that people's level of satisfaction or whatever they feel about their body varies from person to person for various reasons, depending on the relationship, on the reactions that the person give them. So to answer your question, I think, again, like Vani said, I think it's a combination of factors, but that relational thing could play into it as well. Also, to add on to that point earlier about the taboo thing, so this might be me going off tangent a little bit, but like in my work in social class and body image, I noticed that women from like a middle class background tend to be more articulate about their bodies, about features of their bodies, the way they feel about their bodies, the way they think about their bodies. And a lot of it is because of their upbringing, because throughout their lifetime, they have had loads of discourse about their body image. And so it prepares them to identify these feelings and thoughts about their bodies as compared to working class women. So I think the cultural differences also, I think it might extend to cultural differences in this sense, that some cultures tend to talk about the bodies more than other cultures. And so it prepares you to identify these like thoughts and feelings and nuances about your bodies a little bit more than some other cultures. I think that might have an effect as well.
And I think just adding to that, kind of picking up on Jamie's point, one of the interesting kind of gaps in the research that I'd be interested in this space is around how much people actually know about body image and what kind of terminology they put around it, whether they know what it is, whether they can recognize it, whether they know where people could get help. And I think there are lots of factors that could impact, and we know in the context of mental health literacy as a field, there's been a lot of work examining how people recognize particular issues or conditions and whether that then helps people go and seek help. So it may be, even if someone's willing to share about their experience or has language around that or doesn't, even if they're sharing that, what the response that they're going to get or whether people recognize that as a particular issue may be kind of a lottery of whether that person really understands or not. And I think too, it'd be interesting to know around when people are talking about it, in what ways they're talking about it as well. We know from, this is mostly, studies in Western cultures to my knowledge, that, when people are talking a lot about what they dislike about their body, that has negative impacts on their own body image, but also body image in others. But it's pretty normative, particularly in that adolescent period, in girls in particular, that they, talk as sort of fat talk or appearance conversations that they have, and that sort of negative language that we have, it becomes something people do without even really thinking about it. Sometimes it might be that the conversations people are having around their body are positive, and others are neutral, and others are negative, but it might be easier for somebody to say something critical about their body because of this kind of normative discontent or expectation that that's something that happens all the time, particularly in women, that other conversations might be more difficult to have if someone's looking for support or wanting to seek help. But that's just a sort of hypothetical, I guess, or an assumption that might be happening, but we certainly know those conversations, if they're critical, can be problematic.
Thanks, Kristen. So I realize we're running out of time, so I just want to ask one last question to sum everything up. So what strategies would you suggest for BIPOC and CALD individuals to implement into their daily lives, considering all of these factors that we've talked about? How would they be better equipped to navigate all of these issues?
I think besides like the embodiment stuff that I mentioned and the self-esteem stuff that I mentioned, I kind of want to highlight acculturation as well, just because we haven't really spoken about this. Excuse me. But I think so in acculturation research, it suggests that if you identify strongly with both of your cultures, so your ethnic culture and your mainstream culture, it tends to have positive effects on certain domains. So what we've seen so far in acculturation research is that people might have better education outcomes, they might experience better, higher life satisfaction, health outcomes, stuff like that. Although body image hasn't really been studied so far. But it might have a protective effect in that sense. So if you identify strongly with both your cultures, it might buffer against the negative effects of each of the cultures. So I think that might be something to think about.
Yeah, Vani or Kristen, do you guys have any closing thoughts?
I think there's lots of things that people can do. I agree with Jamie focusing on self-esteem and in terms of individual strategies, obviously that's kind of mostly where my work is, around engaging with our body in a way that is connected to it, that is grateful for it, that accepts that it's not perfect. There are moments that we're not happy with our body. That's called being human. And of course, at a point where that's severe or it's constant or it's having a negative impact, of course, people seeking help absolutely is really important. So, unfortunately, we're all going to have those moments, but there are definitely evidence-based strategies that people can engage in or seek help from people like psychologists or health professionals, people that you trust, and seek support if people are really struggling with negative body image in particular. But there are many ways, there are behaviors that we engage in that can be unhelpful if we're checking the body a lot, or we're avoiding situations that can be unhelpful, or kind of having critical thoughts about the body. Often that can really trigger those sort of negative body image feelings that we have. So there are sort of lots of different ways and challenging ideals that are presented to us, and not always, taking those on face value, I think is a really important strategy. There's lots of different things people can do, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But, I think based on sort of what I was referring to earlier, looking at our body as our partner in life, that we experience the world through our body, it's a pretty amazing thing. And taking time to step back sometimes and recognize that and really appreciate that, I think can be really powerful. And it'd be nice if we didn't have to talk about body image, but we obviously do. That's a good part to talk about. So that's my closing thought. Love your body, because it's pretty cool.
Kristen, actually, your research and your practice looks at cognitive behavioral therapies, and how that can improve body image. Do you have any, sorry if this opened a Pandora's box, but if you have any sort of like explicit direct strategies that we can implement in our daily lives, like obviously like meditation or like self-reflection, they're very commonly heard of and known strategies. Do you have anything that could be more culturally specific?
That is a difficult one. I think, cognitive behavior therapy is a whole sequence of sort of strategies. There's probably no one strategy to go off the top of my head. I think one of the something that I would hope is culturally applicable across cultures is noticing the way we relate to our body. I think that can be really powerful, just being aware of how is it that I'm talking to my body in my mind, or maybe it's out loud. What are the kinds of feelings that I experience, and how do I behave with respect to my body? And often part of work that we do with people initially is just getting sort of data, just getting an understanding of how do I experience my body day to day, what impacts my body. What has my journey been like? What are the times in my life where things have been really great around how I relate to my body, and what have been the challenges that I've faced, and what's helped me through those? I think that's something that, of course, that's coming from an individual therapy perspective, and that has lots of but anyway, go into it, but that's one perspective. But I think that's something that anybody can do. And if people are then struggling with their body image, I think absolutely reaching out for help. There are strategies available, there are health professionals available, and there are methods that we know help people. So I think that would be my recommendation. It's not a specific strategy, but taking that time to reflect and think about how you're relating to your body and how you feel about that, I think can be really useful. And then thinking about what are the things I could be doing. And we've talked about lots of different ones today, and there's many that we haven't talked about as well, but there are lots of ways we can improve our relationship with our body. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. And now Vani, any last?
Sorry, we're running out of time, but I think I agree with Kristen and Jamie both. I think that on and nothing like, and from a therapeutic perspective, it's just finding ways to dissociate your worth with your appearance and using social media, because it's such a thing these days, to find strategies to feel good about yourself and ways in which, I think just how they say that you were mentioning meditation earlier, they've said that even taking 5 minutes off and feeling and watching your step, or being deliberate about how you pick up something and being grateful for your body will tell you how much it does for you. And I think that's something that we so quickly forget. And usually people can quickly get angry at their bodies. And usually that's a function of how you look or feel and your appearance, a kind of, finding ways one step at a time, dissociating your worth with your appearance, and not just feel good when you look happy and post and get likes, but also, on days your body gets you through, because some days are really hard, and being grateful for it and just being mindful. And I think mindfulness in general has really good outcomes for well-being. So just like taking a few minutes of like no phones, nothing, just like, like breath work is really good, because it does make you more mindful. And if you do things with a grateful heart, then outcomes would be great anyway. So that's from me.